Greetings, everybody, and welcome to our fourth data scientists, as data professionals, as data enthusiasts, to make sure that the world we're moving towards is more ethical when it comes to data, and we're thinking about how data can uplift everyone as we move forward. We are really excited today to have a featured panel sense of what role can data play in social innovation? What role can data play in helping social entrepreneurs? What are some of the challenges? And what are some of the solutions as we move forward? I'm going to turn it over to Stephen to real quick share a little bit about the roots of this Data Salon series, how it came about, and how we try to embody an ethos as we move forward together as a community. Stephen, welcome and glad to have you here.
Thank you, Dr. Bray. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm just so encouraged by the upwelling that this, if we can call it an industry, is undergoing. That I'm warmed, and I'm warmed to see so many people here and some folks that did this a few years ago in order to really have practitioners in the space build a community of others that they can lean on, that they can learn from, that they can contribute to. With at the first one, and we're carrying through to this one, is just this commitment that we have to inclusion and diversity and ensuring that everyone that we work with feels that they belong. And this is a misogyny, misinformation, exclusion, or any other form of hate, and we really refuse to let our work be a platform for those views. You will be silenced and removed if that happens. We haven't had that issue. Whom we respect and trust, and we look to all of you to really hold us accountable and share advice, whether we solicit it or not, and many of you do, and we really appreciate that and want to encourage that to continue. We bear what you think, and we're in a safe space. This is being recorded. If you have something that you would like to not have in the final recording, this is not being of others, please do let us know. And with that, I'll hand it back to Dr. Bray to introduce our guest speakers.
Excellent, and thank you, Stephen. And again, we have quite an impressive turnout, so we want to thank everybody. I'm seeing a lot of familiar faces. I want to give a shout out to Dina Sharif at MIT. Great to see you as well. And Lucy Turnbull, really appreciate having you here as well. And I recognize I probably have only begun to scratch the surface of a lot of colleagues. Have comments or feedback. One, you can just sort of, let us know in the chat that I have something I want to say. I will circle to you as a participant in this salon, but also you can just raise thoughts in the chat, and it's meant to be interactive. So with that, he has been leading in the social innovation space, trying to make sure data is a force for good. To his credit, with Hashtiv, he did create the world's first GDPR, how it empowers people through employment and education. Bevan, welcome, and if you could real quick both share a little bit more about your background and then share with us your thoughts briefly about the challenges that entrepreneurs and social innovators face.
I appreciate the warm introduction from you as well, and I appreciate all the great things that you've said. I thank you very much, and I appreciate the invite as well. Well, what we're doing at Elevate is we have about 22 million people, 22 million jobs wiped out, and it's a decade of work that's just been wiped out. So we are focused on what we can do to bring jobs back to the market, how we can do what we can do to reskill to a working standard to which we all know. So we're using data to create jobs as well. So thanks, David, for the introduction.
A lot of headaches with making sense of the data out there. It's not as pristine as people would think. Could you maybe share a little bit some of the headaches and what have been some of your conclusions?
Well, one of the chief struggles that we've had moving forward is accurate job data. So accurate job data has been one of the messiest things that we've been cleaning up. Me and my colleagues attached to job link boards, work link boards, and so forth and stuff like that. A lot of these jobs are either expired or have been taken, and there's no accountability for them, and no one, the data is sanitized and clean, and what we present to individuals are actually jobs that are available as well. So we refine their data structure, their models, their data sets a little better as they roll it out for people, and also information and stuff like that pertaining to education, where they can find certificate. Helps us understand the market post-COVID, what industries are leaving, what industries are coming. And according to Bloomberg's research, some of the struggles that we're dealing with, and we've also partnered up with cities and states to help bring an understanding to the landscape to help drive them forward, because it's a new era that we live in, and we feel that
Valeria, who is at MIT and has an impressive background working both as a CEO, working with Ashoka, and is now a senior fellow at MIT. Valeria, if you could real quick share a little bit about your background, sort of the entrepreneurship, and try to help with a world that is more prosperous and peaceful for all involved.
Thank you, David. I mean, first of all, being an engineer, use it in ways that could change the world. In the last 20 years, my work has been focused on social innovation and entrepreneurship. I was part of the Ashoka community for many years, and that allowed me to learn the data that they need in order to deliver the impact that they are after. And I would say that the biggest challenge right now, the biggest need for the sector, it's understanding the size of the social sector today. For example, if you look at a data point in Brazil, before 1990, there were less than 10,000 organizations. That implies an incredible fragmentation, which is the first challenge. And it also represents a big opportunity in terms of aggregation, in terms of synchronizing the actions of this. But in order to do, with respect to that, I want to put on the table for discussion 3 types of very different data needs. One is direct access, and that is the best known. Some say in terms of data, they are going to need to know where the resources are and so on. But the second, and that is very well understood. But the second level, system change interventions, is less understood, and is to demonstrate what models are most effective, system change-wise. And that is a crucial need. And the third and last that I wanted to mention is that in an interconnected world that is constantly changing, mindset to understand that has complex systems change, the way humans see and organize for value creation also changes. That is a crucial change makers. It was literally coined by a former colleague of mine. And today that word is used in multiple settings, and people are starting to introduce, for example, enabling everyone to be a change maker. How do you measure that? How do you monitor it? It's another type of question that I would be interested in discussing.
Excellent, and I think you hit the nail on the head. Discovered online, and then second, how can we share lessons learned in a better way that actually is not just a narrative, but maybe there's more data associated with the lessons learned. GeoTech commissioner that we have, Sue Gordon, sort of framed the same thing you were asking, which is if we're in a world in which we have shared outcomes and shared goals, but distributed delivery of those shared goals and outcomes, and that is a wonderful question that actually we are really interested in people helping to answer. I would encourage people to type questions and thoughts in the chats as well as feedback. And again, thank you, Valeria. Those are really interesting questions. If I could dive a little bit deeper on that sort of distributed, we've seen some success stories there.
I mean, you have efforts that are being made that tend to work well when you wide, you know, it will involve multiple sectors, it will require common data, and that works. It tends to work well when you have the levels that are constantly changing. And if you look at the world, community has increasingly a community of change makers with millions of organizations collaborating. How do you actually integrate those efforts and enable better effectiveness narratives, individual narratives or group narratives, but not necessarily a full understanding of the entire system? And hence, that's the reason why I put forward the question.
Excellent. Thank you. And that's a good setup that you are the person to go to if you have questions about doing AI with the federal government. But if you could real quick share a little bit about your background, and then 2, what you think are the challenges with social entrepreneurs and social innovation. And is it a case that maybe AI might help us with trying to make sense of these individual narratives in a way that we could move forward together as well?
Sure, and thank you very much. So I've been in the federal government space for a little over 20-something years now. So can say that number and I just can't believe it sometimes.
Time flies when you're having fun.
I guess it does. You know, it's either I like it or I'm a glutton for punishment. I'm not sure which yet. But I've seen and participated in multiple kinds of projects and doing a lot of work in the artificial intelligence space. And when I say AI, I use that word loosely because really we haven't discovered true artificial intelligence. We're doing a lot of machine learning activities and trying to make some magic happen along the way. And when you're discovering things such as these social engagements, it presents an interesting set of challenges that we have. We've leveraged some of the open data sets in the federal government. So there's, of course, the negative side that can be taken from the bad actors using that same data to find out information about us. So now to the point about leveraging AI for the social good and how do we seek results. And I think we have to remember that we're humans. Mm-hmm. And humans create data, and humans use systems that create data, and thus we create bias, we create bad data, we create bad outcomes. Models to look at, for example, Twitter trends, and I'll just use that because that's a public data set that everyone can understand. And we can unfortunately sometimes find ourselves on the wrong path and influence ourselves in the wrong way. So I think what we have to do is utilize the models to be able to get us some understanding and still leverage the subject matter experts in the room to ensure that we don't create the bias, we don't create these challenges that we're trying to overcome. And because when you have so much data, it's going to be...
So it's the amount of data. Some say by 2022, 2023, you're going to be looking at 120 zettabytes, 120 billion terabytes of data on the planet, which is twice all the conversations we've ever had as a species. So this is only going to be a world there in which we're seeing what looks like, dare I say, information campaigns, maybe misinformation campaigns that seem to be trying to drive certain narratives. So if people can do certain narratives, how can we do that?
And so, you know, I always tell folks the bad things because then we come back with the good things that you can do. Right. We can't ignore the bad without, it's a two-sided conversation. So yes, you can absolutely do that and be able to present folks with options, with information for the social good. As Bevan was saying, being able to take that jobs data, that's one pretty great way to be able to drive and increase the amount of awareness for folks who are without jobs and who need that information. Being able to drive positive information campaigns or fact, and facts are generally, should hopefully, scientific facts, let's go with that. Scientific facts, and we can be able to create campaigns with that as well. So there are great ways and great outcomes that can be derived from it, where a social good can take place. For example, if we would like to help those who need to get access to food banks, who don't know where they are, that's a great set of outcomes because you don't know where they are, you don't know where these folks live. So let's find organizations, NGOs can support that process to be able to provide some of those logistics to get folks to between both areas and connect them.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Derry. And so now we're at the point where this is going to be really interactive for both our initial speakers, but for all of you as salon participants. I am seeing some questions in the chat, so I'm going to try and raise them. There may not be in the same order we received, but I'm going to try and do a natural flow. The first one actually comes from Lucy Turnbull. And so Lucy, thank you for joining us. I'm guessing you're in Australia right now, so thank you for making the time, given everything you're doing. Lucy asked the question, which is, there's so much innovation doing similar challenges nation by nation, which in some respects sort of divides our efforts. Does anyone have any thoughts, and this can be both to our initial speakers, but also to members of the Salon series, how can we do it where we can actually highlight the best of the best as a cross-border and a cross-regional learning approach, so that instead of us each trying to go it alone, we're actually working across sectors and across nations to make this happen?
I could tackle that. Just a quick, I think the challenge here is being able to share and knowing where to share and having that platform for sharing. Sometimes it gets lost in all the great things that are happening. And as you and I have talked, David, I don't expect I'm the only one creating cool things. I'm positive that we all are. And the question is, are we sharing those great things with others? And do we have a platform that someone can look at to read encourage and increase that level of engagement.
Excellent. Valeria, you look like you had some thoughts too. Go ahead. Yes.
Yes. I think part of the learning, it could come from the environmental movement worldwide, in the sense that a big investment was made by the World Bank on considering environmental data global public good. And that has allowed thousands of organizations to have access to, if not hundreds of thousands, to have access to that information and at least act with better information locally. Now, creating the kind of collective action that the question suggests is a different, it's the next level of challenge. And for that, I want to offer an example that that Stephen Friend, a doctor and who worked for many years with Merck as the head of cancer research. He became an Ashoka Fellow because he left Merck to build a platform for sharing cancer data among the leading drug manufacturers that were involved in cancer research. And his innovation, it was all about creating the incentives for the drug companies to accelerate, to share data and accelerate the cancer research. And if we can translate, not just if we cannot go with the public good option, can we at least go, and this meant that drugs, instead of taking 10 years to develop, would take 5 years, with all the consequence in terms of additional value, commercial value that was created. And that, for me, that's the sweet spot. But for that, you need a nonprofit like the one that Stephen Friend leads, Sage Bionetworks, to do that kind of collective action across an industry.
So we need, so your premise is we need to help with, someone needs to step forward to do collective action, possibly a nonprofit, or possibly, I like the thought, and of course I'm biased, I am in a nonprofit, but it could also possibly be a for-profit that realizes, almost like how, Linux makes the Linux code open source and they're not really about monetizing the code, but then it's the consulting that goes with it. There may be a for-profit out there that recognizes if I help bring people together, I'm not necessarily monetizing bringing people together, but the other things that happen is goodness from that. So.
David?
Bevan, I'm going to turn to you. No, actually, sorry. Maybe I'll go first to Mike, and then I'll turn to Bevan. So go ahead, Mike. You had a thought. Go ahead, Mike.
Yeah. I wanted to mention, as you can see from my background, orbiting the Earth are working. We have a lot of silos, and people worry about bringing those silos together somehow and crossing those boundaries. But I've done a lot of things in which you reimagine that space. Community of practice is an example of that probably most people are familiar with. And so I think you have to break down that paradigm in order to be able to create, like Valeria says, a nonprofit or for-profit if it's profitable for them, with a mission to cross those boundaries and to provide that. It hasn't been done before, rather than just starting with something to begin with. And I think that's really necessary.
I like it a lot, and particularly I like that you mentioned the connection to space, because we know there's going to be huge amounts of data, not just visual images, but just data that's going to become available through commercial space efforts as well as what's already available through government space efforts. If we're not careful, we may end up with that only being in the hands of a few, which would not be a world that I think we want to live in. And so what can we think about making more space data available to everyone?
It's a traditional place where the data is made available, and it's just part of the social dynamic of that community.
Excellent. Thank you, Mike. So Bevan, I'm going to turn to you because there was another question, and I'm glad, again, people feel free to chime in with your thoughts in the chat, as well as your questions in the chat. There was a great question from Tanya, who actually asked, how can we also make sure, it's not just about sharing what's going on and making sure we're aware of the different best of the best efforts, but these efforts, how do we make sure that we have other people weighing in on these inputs? And I know, Bevan, you've done a lot, both with Hashdiv and then later with Elevate U, to actually thoughts, how do we make sure that we're doing data with people as opposed to just to people? What are your thoughts there?
Well, thank you. I think that's a great question. I think one of the key things that we need to focus on is collaboration. collaboration is key. As everything resets post-pandemic, we need to look at and see what industries are coming, what industries are going, and collaborating with educators, collaborating with colleges, collaborating with high schools, because we know the job market has totally shifted. It's totally reset. Employers, 32% of new employers are now looking for how can we get them reskilled, how can we get them reconnected again. So when you talk about all these components and how they need to fit, collaboration is the key. So if we can collaborate with higher ed and high schools and employers and also local government to help them understand the challenges, and we need to meet the challenges as well of what's to come, because no one knows what's going to be ahead of us. We just need to be prepared. And I think collaboration is key, connecting multiple institutions and organizations into one network to help create a better product.
There was a question in the chat from Merv that was asking the question, which is, do we see, just like some countries as being tax havens, are certain countries going to be data havens, which is, I think, a very interesting question. I'm going to open it up to anyone who would like to share some thoughts. I'll add in the world. And so that may actually collide with this idea of having data havens. Are we going to see a future in which we're trying to apply data place in Europe, or you affiliate, say, with the state of California or things such as that? So not sure if anyone has any thoughts on that.
Yeah, but nations collaborating, because we're seeing attempts to kind of force these kinds of collaborations in the context of Global One health initiatives that span the world. The problem is that we do not have a lot of digital trust across the United States in COVID-19. Everybody's using their own solutions, their own data, because they don't trust, even across the state borders. Data havens, sorry, is really building digital trust and data information infrastructure, trust infrastructure, possibly regulation infrastructure, but I need solutions. I think that's where AI solutions also can help, is trust that can help provide evidence of trust that come with data.
Where building that trust is the human infrastructure, of which data may be able to help with some of the attestation to make sure that somebody's not doing something that they should. So what if we had the idea of citizen juries, and citizen juries that were sort of, you're now the top 12 people that for the next 12 months will be data experts, but everybody that's supposed to be representative of the community. And that actually helps you then a little bit with the trust too, so that maybe when 5 or 6 months in, there's summing everything. We've been asking questions of the government. We've been asking questions of private industry. Contrary to what that article says, this is what's really going on. What are your thoughts on that? Or maybe there are other
kind of thing. And I think it also goes back to Bevan's comment about, and my question about the buy-in, where the people for whom the providers, but they're data participators in every aspect of this process. So which enables the use of images as the source of information about wildlife, and so people can just take. And so events where people are not only taking pictures, but following the stream of data and know how the results were arrived at, endanger a lot more trust and people across the country. So similarly, I think we see some of that for COVID, where there is not only transparency, but participation, analyzing and presenting the results, there is more trust. I think there is a way to make this a little bit more institutionalized.
Other people have things, please type in the chat, because I'm trying to track everybody, but there's more cameras than there are screen real estate on my screen. So
I wasn't exactly going to say that, but I guess somewhat close. Started off in a niche way, if you will, and now has become ubiquitous across the world. Group of folks who have never met each other, never really knew each other, and they get together and they collaborate on a platform and they build higher. So clearly we have a model that has worked, right? And the problem that we have where the platform for an operating system, I think the initial part was, well, it's something small, it's not can be done. I think that people lead and operate in an emotion of fear, and that leads, starting back with the news stories. I think this is not a a statement that is provocative eyes for a lot of folks, and people started to not trust data and to not trust things. And so we didn't, and a lot of people started to not trust back. And I think the reason things became weaponized is because the lack of openness. Anytime you make a change or you want to make a change to the entirety of the data, you have to show it all in the open and remove the silos that are there so we can increase the collaboration.
Excellent. And maybe that actually ties in well with a question that we have from Desiree. I'm sure we're all aware of what happened with a large amount of data sets that were used by Clearview AI that none of us may have given consent. And I know, Derry, you've done work with biometrics, and I'm sure other people have. Is there some other way that maybe people can have a voice to make sure that, wait, I gave my data solely for this one purpose, that I wanted to connect with my friend? To put you on the spot, Derry, I'll let you do the first quick thought on this. And then if other people have thoughts, feel free to chime in or type in the chat if you have thoughts about how we make sure that the data we...
In organizations where this was a very important source of topic and things that we were trying to do, wherein data privacy and ownership parameters by which it can be used. So provide certain permissions, and if someone wants to use it for other than the initial intended purpose, provide the in a certain way, that in such an easy way. The actual implementation of that is probably a lot harder than we can all collectively imagine, or we can imagine, but implement, I should say.
Ben, we haven't heard from you, and then we'll go to Valeries. So go ahead, Bevan, real quick.
Sure. When I hear a lot of these topics about accountability and so forth, I think one of the things that we need to talk about, right? Who's accountable? Because for one example, you can say that you're collecting information on someone, but you're using their data for other things that you're not to agree to that policy. There's no accountability, so there's no standard. So unless we have a standard of accountability, then this is just going to fall. That's the major thing that we need to focus on, and create accountabilities and create some guidelines for that as well.
Excellent. Thank you, Bevan. Valeria, and then I definitely want to hear them, please.
As I listened to the conversation, I wondered if we need checks, but literally like a way of sensing human relations. And Esther mentioned in the slide with me, but it makes me wonder if in order to work, everyone, people generating data and people looking at data, need to have a complete different mindset about what data is about.
Mm-hmm. I like what you said, and maybe if I could ask a little bit for it. I mean, if it's almost like how with the printing press, now books became widely available, and so people could start doing literacy in the past in ways that it was actually limited to only a few. It's not just about data literacy, but like you said, it's a new conceptualization. I mean, is it about knowledge? Is it about power? Is it about, financial flows? I mean, do you have thoughts as to what you would say in terms of what data is about as maybe avenues to pursue?
Social entrepreneurs have known all along that data is relative, and that data as we know it today, and it could be used for ill purposes, or it could be used to create a better world. Mm-hmm. And they navigate that ambiguity embedded in data by focusing on human relations. And now that would require different tools, and that is in part the reason, the fact that we don't have those tools to have that kind of accountability and transparency embedded in data when it comes to human relations. I think it's the biggest challenge when it comes to supporting social entrepreneurship, that you need to create like a whole new category of data, focusing not on objects or fixed data, but literally sensing what we create together.
Excellent. I like how you said what we create together. That is, I think, maybe that's what's missing from a lot of things, is we don't think of data as a collective activity, that we're all involved in externalities. Mm-hmm. Thank you. So now I would like to go to Murph, because you raised a really good question, which is we need to start thinking about how we actually begin to think about some of the complications with data, and also think about how data and knowledge is about power. So I was wondering, Murph, if you might be willing to expand a little bit upon your thoughts for everybody here with the salon.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's a reason why all of us, I mean, not only people in general, but starting the people in this call, there's a reason why we don't trust our data with other people, whether that's private companies or governments. We have seen it being used against us, against other people, against vulnerable populations. So in the absence of any governance, in the absence of any liability and accountability, once you let go of your data, you know that it's going to come back and bite you.
Bite you somewhere.
Yeah. So there is a reason why we don't do that. But also, I would like to move away. I mean, we're experts in our own areas, more or less. But I would like to move away from this expert-led, decisions, expert-led principles, whatever. That there's a place for that, yes, but we need to start trusting on the mainstream as well. People know what the implications of data and what is going to come back to them. Mm-hmm. Especially the vulnerable communities, the ones being surveilled, by the ones being abusively policed, whatever it is. We need to get them in the conversation and increase the data literacy and information literacy around that. And I was just looking at one of the comments, making people more literate about the results and all the ways that data brokers or different companies or even governments are collecting this data and what they're using in different ways that they're using it to exert this power. And I don't think the regulation, as much as I want regulation, I don't think it's going to be coming anytime soon, because even before the private companies, states themselves, governments themselves have a lot of invested benefit in using this data without being governed. If you're looking at benefits, if you're trying to catch fraud rather than provide people with benefits, if you're trying to use data to keep people outside of a country, or if you're doing intelligence stuff, there's a lot of ways that the governments use it for the benefit. So why constrain yourself to start with if you're not looking at the general public benefit and public trust?
Very well said, and I think I like what you said, Liz. Let's move away from just making this be expert-led conversations, one that doesn't really help everybody, and it may actually present a wedge issue. Merv, I'd actually ask for a little bit, if you were to try and make a short pitch to policymakers, why they should care about what the public thinks, do you have ideas for what that short pitch might be?
I think that trust is thinning a lot, and we saw that a lot with the COVID stuff, that even in a public health issue, people are on the fence. A lot of people are on the fence or protecting their data. So the trust into the governmental agencies is thinning. There will be a point where that will be completely gone. And once that's gone, once you're not trusting into government, the agencies in democratic institution and the democratic process, I think the consequences of that is a lot worse. Mm-hmm. And a lot lethal, if I can use that word, than simple data issues. We're going at it's like this is going to snowball into a whole distrust issue into the agencies and government itself.
Very well said. If we lose trust in institutions and what they're doing with our data, then we may lose the very civil society that we hold together.
Exactly.
Thank you, Merv. I'm now going to turn to Esther, because I know, Esther, if you're willing to share some of the thoughts that you've been sharing in the chat, I know you've been also grappling a lot with these issues and would be interested in your insights for the Data Salon as well, please.
Yeah, and I could talk for way too long, but I just want to mention a couple of things. One, we're kind of putting a huge burden on data, because we're actually talking about trust and transparency, and it's not so good to trust a government that's evil either.
Mm-hmm. True.
So,
there are times when you should not trust your government whatsoever.
Yes. But I was just thinking of what might be a useful analogy. I mean, if you look at the course of history, when in the Middle Ages, if you looked into a mirror, or maybe it was the Dark Ages, basically the devil was, you could see the devil behind you. Because just seeing yourself in a mirror was this incredibly strange and powerful information that people thought was somehow scary. And I was on the board of 23andMe. I see that around the genome all the time. And so every time some new kind of data comes up, it carries this enormous freight and significance. Let me park that. The challenge we face now is people know that things are happening with their data, but they don't understand. They don't want to read these long disclosure statements. They figure, they've either been too trusting or too untrusting, but they're certainly not going to spend 10 minutes reading something. And so it's as if we were in a world where everybody just bartered, and suddenly we were all being handed bank accounts and being asked to trust that the bank accounts were valid and the money.
We're not going to mess up with your money. Everything's fine. Everything's just fine.
Yeah. And so to some extent, the real challenge is we need a much better education system that teaches people not calculus, but statistics and correlation. And, we're in a world of people who are data illiterate, where data matters a lot. And in a sense, it may not be fair, but we all need to pay our taxes. Somehow we need to feel that same obligation to understand how our data is being used, because it is important to us. And I think ultimately that's the real problem. And I don't know whether our government or any other government is going to be very good at solving it, because they are terrible at education in general. But I like the idea of the citizen juries, which is very much like Fishkin's deliberative democracy.
Right.
Get people who are willing to spend, who are selected by lottery to be representative, to understand this stuff and help make decisions for the rest of us.
Excellent.
But right now we have this extra challenge.
Go ahead, Esther.
Whatever.
No, go ahead. Sorry.
We have this extra challenge of, we are in fact all weaponized. We could be carrying COVID-19. And, people do in a sense have a right to ask me, are you contagious? But boy, is that
where have you been? Who have you seen? What have you done?
That's another explosion. And we're doing it all wrong, because we're accusing them rather than saying, if you're sick, we want to help you. We will pay your medical expenses and we'll look after your family. Instead, we're saying you're an outcast.
Right.
Who's going to be tested under those circumstances?
Very well said. So maybe, Esther, if I could build on what you were saying, which is this is a new type of data literacy, and you talked a little bit about, it's almost like trusting the bank sight unseen, that they're not going to do anything wrong with your money. Do we need the equivalent of CPAs for data, which is, you're just like CPAs, not only do they demonstrate a knowledge of and a skill with, in this case, accounting, but they also have a code of ethics. Do we need something where people do a similar sort of knowledge of and skill with, and they have a public responsibility to the public, not to a specific organization, to uphold that code of ethics, as in this case, a data accountant, much like a financial accountant?
Yeah, it's a brilliant idea. And of course, the poor people can't afford them.
No, I know. And it would have to be something where we have to figure out it's a service available to everybody, including everybody. But I agree. It is an interesting challenge. And I actually see Scott Davis chimed in with generally accepted information practices, which is brilliant, by the way, Scott. So maybe, Scott, if I could turn to you, because you've been chiming a lot in the chat. I don't want to put you on the spot, but your insights are always insightful. And maybe if you'd be interested in sharing some of your thoughts with us, Scott, that would be great.
Thank you. This is what a great conversation. It's been so much fun to kibitz on the side there. It feels like one of the things I want to get to, and David, you alluded to this, was the power thing. Data, information, money, blah, 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 blah. It's power, right? We're talking about power, and we're talking about people organizing and trusting that they're going to organize themselves into something that doesn't screw them over. So that's what we've always done as humans. There was an article in Nature magazine, I don't know, about a year ago, which repeated something I've heard for years, which is that judgmental deities arose at the time of complex societies. And so the idea was, and that's just within the last year, I can find the article somewhere. But the idea is if I sell you a goat and you move away 100 miles, there's no police force. So how am I going to get paid for the goat? Well, I need a judgmental deity, right? Now, if you think about it, we do that now. Copyright, there's no police force for it per se, right? It's kind of it's like neighborhood watch, sort of. You resort to the courts, some specialist courts, but there are some things where we split up the rulemaking and the enforcement and the operations. We're going to need to be doing stuff like that as we move along to make it work. But on the sovereignty side, one of the things I've been thinking about, and I want to engage in a blasphemy here, so my apologies in advance. It's a minor blasphemy, but we invented the flavors of all sovereigns as humans. And I define a sovereign as something that doesn't ask for permission or forgiveness.
Mm-hmm.
So a sovereign, we invented deities. I didn't say we invented God, so we invented.
Of course, all good.
Minor blasphemy. We invented deities, we invented royalty, we invented nation states, Peace of Westphalia, 1648, we invented companies. Those are the sovereigns. Navy, ships at sea, I get it, there's delegations, but those are the sovereigns. They're all teleologies, they're all stories that we tell so we can self-bind to them.
Mm-hmm.
Now we need, these stories are not fit for function any longer because the interaction phase space that's opened up with Moore's law, the fifth order effect of Moore's law is an exponential increase in interactions. Right? And so and that means an exponential increase in risk for engineers and lawyers and others who, if the interactions don't go the way you want them to, that's a risk. So we got this interaction risk increasing exponentially, and all of our institutions and all of our sovereigns were projections that we had out to de-risk so we could self-bind to them. So
they don't work anymore.
That's where we are. So that's not bad news. That's actually great news because all we've ever had to do everything. Look out your window. Look at the house you're in. Look at the buildings we're in. Look at the edifices. All these things, wonderful accomplishments, have always been without projections.
Mm-hmm.
So it's just now we have a chance, an opportunity. I mean, look at this group. This is the narrative, the rhetoric that we need for persuasive speech is to persuade ourselves that as a species, quite frankly, to persuade ourselves we're worth it at this point, the effort of putting together a story for ourselves. And I think it's going to be computational sovereigns. It's going to be AI, cryptography, blockchain type stuff. Not that they run everything, but they have sufficient authority vis-a-vis X or Y so that we can rely upon them and delegate that bit of authority to them. And then we build the rest of the structures around that bit of inviolable authority until that then shows wrinkles too. So that's it's not really a helpful comment in some ways, but in some ways it is, because it lets us rely on a lot of other sources that we previously haven't. We kind of think of this as a tech problem in the public, but we know on this phone it ain't the tech problem.
It's a people problem. It's us.
and that's not a problem, because what are we? We're people. Yeah. That's pretty good. So we got a good shot at taking care of this, right? Anyway,
yeah, I like that a lot. And actually, I mean, I think I really appreciate that you expanded the envelope to say maybe we need new narratives, new stories that have the influence of self-policing. And that's the beauty of like what CPAs were. It was the idea that you would do the right thing even if nobody was watching because you took a code of ethics. Maybe we need the data deity as a way to move forward in terms of how we have that narrative. I'm going to turn to Nikhil. Nikhil, if you're willing to share thoughts, because I know you've been doing a lot in both your current day job, but also with the Atlantic Council, thinking about how we make sure data is not weaponized. And so, Nikhil, you did type a chat in here with both a question and a thought. If you could share that with everybody, that would be great. And then share some of your thoughts about how we make sure data is not weaponized against small communities or minority communities.
Yeah, I guess the question, I guess I kind of talked about it in the chat, is we focus a lot on data and how it's being used. And I think a lot of that has been kind of in the community, right? Like in terms of thinking about, oh, like, what are we using? Like, what is the data that we're using? And thinking about the privacy implication and things like that. But I guess the question I'm really wondering is, to what extent what is the end aim of the data that we're using, right? And so if you look at it through history, and this is kind of really tied to more of my recent work, when we think about how data is used for different reasons, right? And it can be the same data set that's used for different purposes. One that's used to empower a certain community, while in the same vein, that same data is being used to marginalize another community. And we know that for like public health or something like that. And so then it's really the question of like, when it comes to something like education, are we thinking about data in and of itself, or are we really focusing on who the people who are using the data, right? So who is the one who is using the data to create whatever that is, whether that's a business model, whether that's a public sector goal. whatever that is. And so I think then it kind of comes down to a question of what is that end purpose? And I think that's kind of the part that I really grapple with, because until otherwise, my concern is we're hitting kind of one of the symptoms of saying, oh, here's all the problems that we're seeing, but that's really a symptom, right? And I think there's a deeper root cause, and it's trying to examine that more and focusing more on that. So when, in the case of data being weaponized against marginalized communities in the US, it's not that it's data, it's not that it's tech companies, right? It's the history of racism. It's a history of inequality. And so that, I think, is where I might argue that that's really where we should be focusing on. And anything else is kind of focusing on the data, is really focusing on a symptom, and there's importance to that. But knowing that we're not actually going to be able to solve the real problem until we deal with the underlying issue of, for example, in this case, racism.
Excellent. So I'm actually going to take what you said, because I think what you just shared there, Nikhil, builds on comments that Valeria and Tanya said. So maybe I'm going to go to Valeria and Tanya, and then maybe go to Derry and Bevan to close things out. And Stephen, if you want to have the final last word. You talked a little bit earlier about that we need to have a new approach to data, and new conceptualization of data. And maybe Nikhil just teed up there the idea that it's not just about the data itself, but it is actually the how it's being used. And I might even expand even further that, let's say you had the same exact use, but one use actually got people's consent, and another case did not get people's consent. I think we would say that quantitatively the outcome, while virtuous, if it was a good outcome, would still be quantitatively different if you did not get people's consent for the same outcome. But maybe Valeria, if you could go first in terms of thoughts on Nikhil's thoughts about how we look at the use, and maybe how that informs a new conceptualization of what data is.
In listening Nikhil's thought, what prompted in my mind, it was recalling a conversation with Stephen Friend about his model. It started with, like I explained before, companies shortening the time to produce cancer drugs. And then after like 7 years of working on this, he had a bigger idea than that, which is to get cancer patients to share their data real time. Mm-hmm. And the implication there, and this, by the way, is something that we haven't taken off in this conversation, which is literally listening and capturing the voice, unedited voice of people. And when you have that, the research protocols are no longer the silo view of a researcher that is interested in X, Y, or Z, but is literally the life experience and narrative, unedited, of a person that is suffering the very essence, the very thing that we're trying to solve. So I'm wondering if that is a new frontier that we need to do much more. And that would be critical for social entrepreneurship, because without that, social entrepreneurs are only partially effective.
Excellent. And that's, I think we could easily have another data salon on this, Stephen. So we may have this tees up some wonderful things for us to consider. I want to respect people's time, but for those that can stay around, we are going to continue. I'd like to go to Tanya next for her thoughts. And then I've seen that Austin has actually raised an interesting thought in the chat too. So maybe after Tanya, we'll go to Austin for some thoughts too. So Tanya, your thoughts.
Yes, I really am absorbed also in this conversation that's happening in parallel in three different modalities here. But and to kind of summarize it from my perspective is, I think that we really are talking about two separate two aspects. There's the data, and then there is the purpose of data and the process which leads to achieving that purpose, that use. And I think we need different views, different regulations, different trusts, different evidence of trust, and buy-in both into data and the process. I think we're much better about understanding data and the good and the bad about data per se. I don't think, a lot of part of lack of trust about the data is not about the data, it's about the use of data and the purpose to which, and the uncertainty and anxiety of what could be done rather than what actually is done quite often. And I think we don't really, we're not even at the beginning of understanding sort of the purpose, the process that gets us to that purpose, and sort of which is the meta part of it. And I think that's sort of circling at the beginning of this conversation, AI for, which is based on data, but really creates all the processes. That's where the good and the bad is going to happen.
Excellent. Thank you. And I agree. Maybe we need to recognize where we're currently better at and where we're currently, in some respects, almost operating with a blank slate and trying to figure out intentionality and some things like that. So Austin, you raised some interesting thoughts in the chat. Would you be willing to share some of your thoughts, elaborate for everybody here?
Sure. Actually, my name is Kasia. Catherine
Oh, sorry,
Austin
Kasia.
Barnes, but
apologies.
okay.
I was just reading off the chat.
Yeah, that's all right. Austin Barnes is my last name. So I haven't thought this through, but I'm going to refer to a book that I read many years ago, and it's called H is for Hawk. And it's the story of someone who basically trains a hawk. And in this novel biography, she talks about the exquisite capabilities of a hawk. And I was thinking about this, and I was thinking that really what we want as living organisms is to survive. Mm-hmm. And what is data? Data is what we take to make a decision. There's an analytic capability to it. In the purest of senses, our species determines what data we absorb, and we instinctively react to it. So a hawk is going to instinctively react one way, a fish is going to instinctively react a different way. And when you have a very rich eco environment, you have a lot of organisms that will react differently to similar stimuli because they absorb that data differently. And we create ourselves a much richer environment, I think. I'm elaborating here. But when we create monocultures where we have just corn or just a lot of people that get caught by COVID, we put ourselves at a precipice. And I'm in the business of standardizing data, so don't get me wrong. I like standardizing data when I have to do a job with it. But the way to prevent evil is to have multiple viable solutions to preserving a globe. And that relies on many types of organisms able to react to similar stimuli with completely different outcomes. And so I actually think that if we want to survive this data world, we really actually have to have these separate pools of data that can't be communicated, where you become impervious to contamination. I haven't thought this through, but I'm sort of thinking that as we evolve, standardizing everything might not be a good solution, but encouraging isolated data and putting value around endangered species might not be a bad thing.
I see what you're saying, and especially if you think about some nations that may be going more towards surveillance state, the more you make data readily standard and available, the more easy it is to bring it all together, which becomes more tempting for certain actors. So
and when we start, I mean, now of course the answer is a whole, right? As a globe, we want to be able to coordinate action, and we want to be able to do things together.
Right.
But I think for survival, you really have to be a separate thing.
And I see Desiree is nodding his head. So Desiree, you actually raised a really great point in the chat. Desiree, are you okay if I call on you to real quick share your thoughts? So I'm calling on you, Desiree. Please share.
Awesome. So thank you so much, David. So my point is basically right now there are so many big companies, Microsoft, Google, Facebook, that are trying to build data center in Africa because they could not stay from the US and harvest that, right? Because of the connectivity issue. But the thing is, if for a company that has like 10 times the GDP of a country comes there and say, hey, I'm going to build a brand new center, what can you do, to protect what is good for you? Absolutely nothing. So I think that goes to a point that we need some decentralized systems that are going to be data for people further in their country. And that's only when you can have some value and do what you need to do for yourself instead of just playing to the purpose of like a big evil or good.
Excellent. Thank you, Desiree. And that's, I think, a really great insight to remind that in some respects, before the internet, Africa was less likely to have its data exploited. And while the internet connectivity is clearly something that we hope is a force for good, we need to be mindful that it could also, unfortunately, be exactly the opposite. So thank you for raising that. I'm now going to try to shift to lightning round to be respectful for everyone's time. And I'm going to do Derry. Esther, I'd like to call on you again. Also, I want to give a shout out. I think you win the prize for the best background ever in the midst of a pandemic. And then Bevan, to sort of give closing thoughts real quick. Derry, if you were to try and give 2 or 3 sort of action steps forward based on everything you heard today, whether it's for the public sector, the private sector, or what we ourselves as data practitioners can do, what would be sort of 2 to 3 tweet links recommendations you might have?
Sure. I'll try my best to get to tweet links. We've had this conversation multiple times, so hopefully I'll get better each time.
Oh, that's good.
With regard to, I think Bevan brought up the good point, and we all collectively agreed. Data is data, and that's just a technology thing. We are still humans, and I started that, back in the first part of this conversation. We all have to agree that no matter what we do with data, we're still humans. So we have to bring the human aspect back to the conversation. And in doing so, that pivots to a couple of places. One, I think we use the word education training. I think we have to figure out the right combination, but we treat data, we treat technology as something that you just sort of use. You grab a phone, you grab an iPad, you grab your laptop, whatever the case may be, and you just use it. And we hand it to the kids now who are, my daughter's using it, and so I see her using it. But I would say my daughter's probably a little bit more educated, not just on the iPad, but what happens when she pops the data in and where it goes. So it's an educational piece that starts early in informing the ownership and understanding of that data and what it can be used for and what it can't be used for. And I would say, more importantly, what it should be used for in a positive way, and recognizing that, because if we start as an adult and we forget to train from the start, we lose the game entirely.
Right.
Period. We face the cycle continuously. So we have to start somewhere. So if we don't start with the younger generation now, we will not be successful. And in doing so, we should also provide, this is the second part, make sure that corporations are going to try to conform to these norms. I think, Bevan, this is the part you mentioned. If you're going to not sell data, actually mean it. And give consequences to that. Now, whether that's a regulatory body that's self-regulatory versus a governmental body, I'll leave that up to people who are much more smarter than me to handle those challenging conversations. But we need to find a way where corporate citizenry is back on the positive and trusted side, and we have to start finding a way to do that. I think without that, it won't be able to be moving forward in a good, positive manner where we can trust that we can share our data with those folks and the group of people and know that they will be used in the intention and in the way that we would like, in that positive outcome. So that way, when I do share my COVID-19 data with other people, it is used in the right way and not in a negative way.
Excellent. Thank you, Derry, as always. I really appreciate your insights, and I think you got some other people agreeing with what you said in the chat. Esther, interested in your 2 to 3, ideally tweet links answers, if possible, for what we can do.
Okay. Well, one is just a +1 to what Derry said. 2 is the challenge with data is it's kind of the opposite of money. Money is fungible, and if I have it, you don't. Data is sort of the opposite of fungible, because the essence of data is that it's unique. And if I have it and I give it to somebody, they all have it. And so really important to understand those distinctions. The second thing is, I mean, education is one. The other way to solve this, I think, is fundamentally a much stronger liability regime. And a liability regime isn't just you can get sued. It's much broader. It includes insurance companies. And the amazing thing insurance companies did back at the beginning of the last century is they didn't simply insure against fires. They started fire inspections, and they reduced the danger of fires. So if I'm now going to be liable as a corporation for misuse of data, I'm going to want to get insurance, and the insurance company is going to come in and vet my practices, and that's what really needs to happen, because now there's no real accountability. Cambridge Analytica, Equifax, hospitals, every week somebody breaches some data, and nobody really cares, because nobody really cares. If we turn it into something where you're liable, and then there's, like the data CPAs you mentioned, these are corporate data CPAs who make sure that you're not selling stuff to Cambridge Analytica. There's this concept of the data supply chain. People are beginning to care whether their socks were made by child labor or not. People are also going to start paying attention, I hope, to this data supply chain. And, well, how did you find out that I like red sweaters? Anyway.
Very well said. And I love what you said about how insurance was a forcing function for fire inspections. I think that's a thing we need to borrow. Also, I can say from personal experience where our family cat's prescription apparently showed up on my wife's medical record as something she was getting. It begs a lot of question as to whose data was shared with whom to create that error, and what's her recourse when that happens. I mean, we looked at her like, pretty sure that's a medication for a feline. But anyway, you hit the nail on the head, Esther. Thank you very much. That's very insightful.
This was great.
All right, Bevan, bring it home for us, and then we're going to go to Stephen for closing remarks from our partners at Accenture. So Bevan?
Well, I strongly agree with Esther on a lot of things she said about data and harnessing data and engineering of data. And I personally think data is becoming the core of corporate companies as assets. So they're holding it as assets. So they're selling it as assets, holding it as assets. So I personally think that we really need to create data governance, right? It doesn't have to be in depth, right? It could just be on some of the basic practices where, you can be audited, right? So it doesn't have to be everyone. It could be like how the tax system currently works. So if you do something that's not right or you got breached, then we can audit you to make sure that what you're doing to protect your customers and users is actually up to par. Because most companies, corporate companies, are using these things as assets. So we need to regulate them. We need to have some type of governance, and we need to have some type of trust with the government. So this is important, because when companies break the laws like TikTok and so forth and stuff like that, now the government is stepping in and saying, hey, here's the red light over these guys' head. They've been doing this. A lot of it is underage information from children. And this could be a problem long term because other countries or states are collecting data against you. So I think the government needs to look at this as a global problem that we need to figure out how we're going to make companies accountable, like TikTok. Some of the things that we can do, we can audit them if they're not in compliant. So data governance is important, and I will leave it as that. I also agree with Dari, what he said about his, how it's hard with his child, and how you have to teach them and educate them, but then that's another hurdle, right? Are they really going to want it, or do they care? I mean, it's so easily accessible. What kind of restrictions can we put? How will they feel about the restrictions? So governance is extremely important in how we view it. And I think we got to start from the smallest steps and then work our way up, maybe with breaches and certain things like that, making companies like TikTok and Facebook accountable, Twitter accountable. They can't go to the Senate and say, hey, I don't know this would happen. This is not my fault, right? This is not my fault. Why don't you do something about it, right? So who's going to do something about it is the last thing I would leave us with here today. Excellent. Who's going to do something about it? Yep.
The call of action to us. We are the cavalry. All right, Stephen. So again,
I just love this. I am beaming so much because this is why we set this up. Who's going to do something about it? We're going to do something about it, right? The reason why this exists is so that we can establish best practices in this space. Scott David has been an advisor of mine for a long time. And, he was the first in my network to say, look, until you get to liability, look at cybersecurity and let's get to insurable risk. And so we framed all of this around that. And one of the places we hope to get to with this salon is really to establish best practices for the industry. Now, our roadmap to get there was, shall we say, added some hurdles with this pandemic situation. But that's where we want to get. And so there's 3 points that I want to kind of echo of what I've heard. The first is around humanity. The second is around shared success and power dynamics. And the third is around trust. And so, a couple little anecdotes, and I'm going to try to keep this short. At a client situation right now, we're looking at data quality issues. And the aha moment was that it came back to the humanity of the people involved, right? We were asking very binary data things for them to do. And once we started connecting with their humanity, our data quality issues started resolving themselves, right? So until we can really kind of connect to that aspect, we can't move forward. And this notion of shared success and power dynamics, right? I've always said, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And this is true whether your data science team has diversity on it. And this is also true if your governance regime has those subjected to the AI's feeding into governance as well. How are you getting that feedback? How do you have shared success, not just with those offering the technology, but those that are supposed to be benefiting from it? And then, finally on kind of trust, we really can't trust others without engaging with them. And so, in an increasingly isolated world, what we have is a decline of trust. And if without that foundation of trust, it's really hard to build the house that we're trying to build. And so, this is how we're doing it, right? We're getting together, we're having shared success, and hopefully we will get to this point where we can establish some best practices for the industry to build additional trust, to share success, to share power, and to reconnect with our humanity. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you all for staying. This was truly a fascinating conversation. We will share a synthesis of the notes. We will also, again, reach out to you if there's anything that you feel like you want to make non-attribution, not included in the notes or not included in the video recap. Just let us know. We will also share details as to when the next salon is going to be in October. We're finalizing those details. But to build on what Stephen said, we are the Cavalry. So if you have any additional feedback, if you have any additional links you want to share, we will be reaching out to you. This is your platform. Help guide us as to where we need to go. With that, thank you all very much. Stay safe, and thank you for everything you do as positive change makers and change agents.